As we know, certain governments, including our Canadian Liberal government, are demanding consumer acceptance of electric cars by 2030. But there are those sounding an alarm as to the actual costs to the environment, communities, and consumers. To enlighten us more on the cause of caution on electric vehicles and about a controversial proposed bill the Trudeau Liberals plan to introduce, we have Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science joining us from Calgary. Michelle, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's great having you. Now, first off, can you describe the biggest differences between a petrol-powered car versus an electric car? Would it be durability or maybe just efficiency?
A lot of the people promoting EVs are promoting the aspect of energy efficiency because in the actual operation of an EV, it is somewhat more energy efficient. But you need to really look at the back end of it, at the embedded emissions, and also all the things around an EV, like the infrastructure doesn't exist for it. We don't have enough power generation to support it. We'd have to build 10,000 megawatts more power just for the EV policy. And remember, the federal government is saying that we should electrify everything. So think how many more power generation plants we need. But there are other problems with EVs. They don't operate very well in extremely cold or extremely hot weather. You can't tow them. So if you go in the ditch, you can't just be towed out. You need a flatbed to come and pick you up. You
Oh,
can't bring a jerry can of electricity to somebody if they're stuck on the road. And the range reduces rather rapidly in cold weather. So I suppose if you're going between Calgary and Edmonton, that's not a big deal because you could stop in Red Deer and charge up. But if you're off-road or in the mountain highways, that could actually be life-threatening.
right. Now, my dentist drives an EV and she has a practice in both Lethbridge and Calgary. She says in the winter, she barely has enough energy to get to Calgary. She has to charge up right away. And because the car's not generating its own heat, and so it has to use power to generate the heat.
That's right. There's a story in, I think it's called Motor Mouth, and a couple of people drove all across the US in an EV to prove that they could do it. And I think they did it in about 3 days. But they did it without any cabin heat, with 3 layers of clothes and blankets.
Oh, wow.
And, that's not how people normally want to travel. So they completely cut off the cabin heat. Now, for cities, I mean, EVs are probably a good choice within the city. But, a hybrid vehicle does both. It reduces emissions in the city and it also gives you the range on the highway. So I'm not sure we need to flip our systems completely upside down.
Right. So a country as vast as Canada, we're one of the largest countries in the world, and we're really spread out. Isn't there a market share for both EVs and traditional gas-powered vehicles?
I would say yes, because a lot of the push for this comes from urban centers and from the urbanized East, where people in Montreal or Toronto, especially those who are downtown, they don't understand that people here, especially those in rural communities, our farmers, our ranchers, our oil and gas workers, they're traveling hundreds of miles and they need very reliable vehicles. They need the power of diesel. I think people don't understand that we can't just transform our delivery systems, our freight cars, big semis. The battery weight for a semi would make it almost impossible to carry a load of goods. We can't do these things overnight, and I don't think it's been well thought out.
Battery weight for a semi would be astronomical, not to mention how much a battery for a train would be. Now, are there industry warnings that there's not enough rare earth materials on the planet to feed the needed resources for building future electric cars?
Yes, I think quite a few manufacturers, I think it was Toyota specifically, said that they're not going to really be going into EVs. And that was one of the reasons. And people have to understand not only is the supply chain not there, because EVs use a lot of rare or critical minerals that are quite different from our conventional vehicles, which just basically rely on, iron and steel and aluminum. These use very exotic materials like rare earth minerals that are primarily mined out of China or out of contested areas in the Ukraine or out of Russia. So access to some of those markets is blocked, or access per se in China gives them an advantage over North America. And it would be, for some of these minerals, I think it was Simon Michaud who did a study for the Finnish Geological Survey, and he found that for some of the minerals, to mine sufficient minerals, it would take hundreds, if not thousands of years to meet the goals of the proposed EV switch and the net zero goals. Thousands of years.
Thousands, wow. Now, for electric vehicles, when you're driving around, you see a gas station. You'll see a gas station every few blocks. Not every one of them has a charging station, and the idea is that eventually there will be more charging stations, and we'll be charging up our vehicles at home. But do you have an idea of the estimate of the cost of electric cars to our electrical grid?
Well, it's enormous. As I mentioned, we would need at least 10,000 megawatts more power just for the EV policy. And that means that we would need at least, actually, as it turns out, we would need 19 Site C dam equivalents. And each one of those kind of power generation facilities takes 20 to 30 years to build. Then you also need all the interconnecting wires, the integration services. It's a phenomenally complex thing, and people actually hate power lines. It's more than they hate pipelines. So it's not going to be something that can be accomplished overnight. So I think there was a report recently that we're at about $99 billion to do the full backup for the EV policy. I think that's probably low, but $99 billion to facilitate a car that is less efficient, or vehicles that are less efficient and less suited to our climate, seems like a non-starter to me.
Now, are electric cars just a stopgap before fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia become more commonplace?
I would say not. First of all, hydrogen and ammonia are very dangerous substances, and they're well handled in industrial settings where people are trained to handle them, and there's instrumental monitoring. But in the public's hands, I see quite a danger there, and this is supported by a hazardous expert who wrote an article which I assisted in the translation, and also by Samuel Ferfari, who's a professor in Belgium who worked for many years with hydrogen, and he sees it as an absolute non-starter. Not to mention, hydrogen also goes through many stages to be captured because it doesn't exist naturally in nature. It has to be made. And in that process, you're actually losing energy at every step, which is not what you want for energy. That's why oil, gas, and coal are so popular and so integral to our society, because they're energy dense and they give you more. They give you more energy, and they also give you more product stream. So I don't see hydrogen and ammonia becoming mainstream at all. And also, there's no infrastructure. It's the same problem as for EVs, only much, much worse, because at least with EVs, we do have an electrical infrastructure that we can build onto and tap into.
Now, switching gears here, federal natural resources leader Jonathan Wilkinson has said he is moving ahead with the controversial Just Transition bill. He says he hopes his government will introduce the bill early this year, and that will transition workers from the oil and gas sector to green energy jobs. Now, your organization, Friends of Science, released a report on this proposed bill. What are some of the highlights from your report?
Well, I think the first question is just transition to what? If you look at the IEA, that's the International Energy Agency chart about Canada's total energy consumption, you'll find that wind and solar barely even surfaces on that chart. We're powered in this society by coal, natural gas, hydro, nuclear, oil, and some biomass. But wind and solar don't even figure. And wind and solar have to be made with oil, gas, and coal, huge quantities of oil, gas, and coal. So what are they contemplating that we would transition to, and what would those things be made from? Other aspects of it is if we phased out oil and gas in the West, where would we get the replacement income? Because I don't remember the exact figure. I think it's about 18% of our exports are for our GDP is from oil, gas, and coal. So, what's going to replace that for income? That income, that and the taxes paid by oil, gas, and coal companies, that is what funds our educational institution. It funds our healthcare, paves our roads. It runs our society, pays our government. So where will that money come from? Because you can't export wind and solar, and we don't have any of the wind and solar facilities in Canada either. And it would be very difficult to set them up because, again, a lot of the materials, the critical minerals, come from China. So you say, okay, well, we have a critical mineral policy in Canada now, which we do, but it takes about 16 years to get a mine up and running. And actually, I just heard the other day from the Macdonald Laurier Institute, they were saying that not one major project has been approved under the new Environmental Act. So that would be Bill 69. So this is more than 4 years. Nothing has been approved under it. So how are you going to get these mines approved when you won't approve a pipeline, which is, something that we know how to do, and we have many of them all over North America? How can it be done? Just transition to what? To when?
Now, when we think of oil and gas, we think of fueling our vehicles and heating our homes. But could you just describe for a moment maybe the top 5 or 10 products that come from oil and gas? Because it's not just about gas and heat.
Well, it would be difficult to do the top 5, but let's start with the medical services industry. Almost all of modern medicine relies both on the energy from natural gas and coal and oil, and also the product stream. I mean, all the PPEs, all the masks, the gloves, the sterile use, single-use plastics that are used in surgery, almost everything, even pharmaceuticals, all of these things rely on byproducts from oil, gas, and coal. The modern medicine would vanish overnight without it. So do we really want to go back to kitchen table surgery and people boiling strips of old sheets as bandages? Clothing is made from different elements of oil and gas, plastics, all the plastic bottles. You go into a grocery store, look at how things are wrapped in like saran wrap and plastic bags for bread. Do we really want to get rid of all those things? If you're in a small village and you have a village baker and they give you bread over the counter with their hands, okay. But if you have bread being shipped hundreds of miles across the country, you want it safely stored in a plastic container, right? In a bag. So, there are lots of public health issues related to this notion of phasing out oil and gas, because all of those products that have made our public sanitation very good, they vanish. Then what happens to the public? We get sick.
Right. And you talked about modern medicine being effectively shut down just because of oil and gas. Now, Alberta shares its prosperity with other provinces through equalization payments. Now, much of that money comes from our oil and gas. How will other provinces be affected by these numerous Alberta industries being stifled or shut down?
Well, first of all, of course, there's the equalization payment, which I won't go into because it's been talked about a lot. But people don't realize that a lot of people work in Alberta. Some of them are traveling workers. They live in BC, Saskatchewan, the Maritimes. They come here, they work in the industry for maybe a few weeks and go home, or maybe a few months and go home. And they take their riches, if you like, back home, and they build prosperity at home. Maybe they start a small business, they buy their house that they've longed to buy. Many of our products heat the homes in other provinces. Like, people don't realize that British Columbia doesn't run on hydro, runs on about 59% natural gas. Propane in Alberta heats Quebec. There are many domino effects of trying to shut down Western oil and gas production. And when I say Western, I include Saskatchewan in this. They're a smaller producer than we are, but they're very important. Not to mention agriculture, fertilizer. Fertilizer is made from natural gas. And without fertilizer, you can't have the kind of abundant crops that we have today. And also, when farmers harvest, many times the crops come in a bit damp. So they use what they call a natural gas dryer to dry the grain. And that's, very important to keep the quality of the grain up, because you don't want to harvest a crop and then have it go moldy. Then it's no good for human consumption. You might be able to use it for animals, but and we're at a critical point in the world right now, a very critical point. A lot of the fertilizer factories in Europe have shut down because the price of natural gas there has skyrocketed. They can't afford to operate anymore. And we've lost the fertilizer production out of the Ukraine. Whatever there is in Russia will be blockaded. I think the UN said there's something like 300 million people in the world now facing starvation. That's because the blockade of wheat and the loss of fertilizer. So we won't have abundant crops, and we will have many people facing famine. And if we shut down the oil and gas industry in Alberta, we'll make that worse for everyone else in the world and, of course, at home.
Well, I have so many more questions for you. This has been a great conversation, Michelle, but sadly we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.